if you want to own your own orbital greenhouse, which is pretty sick, and then grow a bunch of plants on it, and then also decorate all of those rooms to like fit the aesthetics of your plants that you choose, and then all the meanwhile you can feel really good about it because you're saving the planet that you're orbiting around. I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer for me. That's Plantasia. I feel like the sort of single asset and idea that exists in the game that I'm most proud of, and I feel like is a great example of that tie between art and narrative, is probably the seed bank and just the way that that was developed, because that structure was informed, I think, in a very interesting way. Like, I was looking at a lot of these sort of massive reactors as reference, as well as very strange seed pods and these like seed pod-esque sculptures that an artist had made. And I eventually just sort of combined those features into this one sort of piece of hardware. And then as our narrative designer continued developing the role that that device played in the story, we sort of tweaked, details of it as to how it related to the technology that had been developed in the world and how that was important to everything, and the way that that device will sort of change over the course of the game as you progress through planting all these different plants. That singular asset was one that I was really proud of. I think the feature I'm probably most excited for people to get their hands into, there's sort of two. The first one is the plant hybrids, and I'm excited to see those combinations sort of pop up and see what people think of them and see if people think they're interesting. And then the other system is all of the decor. We put a lot of work into that so far, and we want there to be a really diverse set of items so that the player can really put their personal aesthetics into the space and still have it be in line with the style and world building that I've set up. I hope all of those options really give players everything that they want to customize. The visual development of this game sort of surprisingly came about pretty easy. Of the early part of the team, we were all pretty sure on what we wanted the game to look like, and I didn't have to present too many options to Ayla until we landed on something that we really liked. And she really liked my art from the beginning. That was very fortunate. And I had proposed a few different cultures to infuse into the game style, because that is a big part of making an interesting world, is connecting it with real life things, because it makes it feel grounded. It gives it something the player can connect to and realize, like, oh, I recognize that thing, and then this is how we've sort of twisted it into a new concept. Like I said, I'd proposed a few cultures, then we sort of landed on indigenous South American culture, which our narrative designer is, closer to, so that was sort of a natural fit for him to be pulling from. It was something that I had incorporated into a project recently as well, so that was something that I had recently been using as reference and researching, and so that was just sort of furthering that line of thought. Since then, it was just a lot of sort of nailing down those art pillars. It's really basic questions of like, is this architecture, like, we're going solar punk, but that can mean a lot of different things. Are we going more organic, or are we going more geometric? Like, where are we leaning with that? Is it super industrial and still like overgrown, or does it feel more sort of handcrafted, sort of artisanal? And so that was a big part of just nailing down the look of the game. From there, as for the plants, we were sort of deciding like, okay, what plants, all of these plants have to look alien, but the goal of the game is to be a cozy game that is reminiscent of classic house plants. So find plants that are weird on Earth to pull inspiration from and still make them sort of leafy and pretty, because I think a lot of the time alien plants, not that this is a bad thing at all, but alien plants will often go very strange, like weird porous shapes and these like bubbles, and it can get very weird, which is great for alien plants, but that gets us much further away from this house plant look, which was very important to the game. So sort of finding that middle ground was a big part of that early development and just core to the game. Creating those characters, I think one comes with a lot of trust. I've known Val for a long time, and I think he just, on one hand, trusts me to make designs that he is happy with. The other thing that's a big part of it is all the cultural influences that he puts into the character descriptions. I really just start researching those. I start researching what that traditional attire is like in that culture, and then I'm just combining those elements where I sort of see any fashion overlap, if that makes sense, like where garments are similar in the reference that I've gathered just as like, this is our general Plantasia sci-fi attire reference, and combining those things into a new outfit. I'm also trying to keep it in line with the in-universe organization and the uniforms that they would have, and then the different departments of that organization. You can sort of change up the colors of the uniform to distinguish what their role is. The pose and the elements of the costumes are also supposed to give you an immediate realization of what their job is. So those elements are a big part of it. And really, after that, it's just like infusing it with the sort of attitude that Val has given them, and from there, it's just communication with him and tweaking those designs and making sure that they feel on par with what he has done. The fact that he also includes a couple character inspirations in his descriptions that I can then look up, and whether that's like one character gives off this one vibe, or one character typically wears high fashion stuff versus like more grungy stuff, or any of those kinds of things. I'm incorporating all of that into those designs. The other interesting thing for this project is that this is the first game I've worked on where you're not a character maneuvering a space. Like, Plantasia is basically a point-and-click game. And so that means that I'm thinking about the screen space in a much different way, because as much as it is backgrounds and props and, then characters popping up for dialogue, like, it's basically all UI when you boil it down. It's all just a user interface, which means that I'm having to think way more than I've had to in any of my previous projects about the screen space that everything takes up and the layout of everything, and making sure that everything gives all the other elements enough space to be functional and look nice. As an artist, I'm very much drawn to just like make the thing that looks best. And that does not always go hand in hand with making a functional setup for the player to interact with. Once we got Steph, our UI lead, on board, like, there's a lot of back and forth. And then once we got stuff in engine, there was even more back and forth about like making sure everything was properly spaced, making sure everything stood out from one another, making sure that all these elements worked in harmony, not to just be a nice visual, because the player's not actually moving around them. They have to be able to see it all at once and have it all that information read clear. So that was a big element to work on. A big part of it just from the beginning was the games that Ayla provided as reference, stuff that she had played that she wanted to pull from. And there weren't super clear visuals from the very beginning, and I think a lot of it was just her trusting me and liking my art enough that she knew that I was going to make something that she liked. And obviously that process is a lot of back and forth. Like, it's not just Ayla gives me this one idea and I come back to her and boom, like, I've translated her mind onto the screen. A lot of those questions that I have talked about geometric versus organic, or like how industrial, how handmade, those were all questions that I was constantly posing to her and seeing sort of where she was at. Even if she didn't have the clearest picture in her head, she obviously has sort of an instinctual response to one of those questions. And so from there, I could sort of tell which way she was leaning. With enough of those questions, you can build a style guide and you can figure out what those art style pillars are. And from there, it's just sketching stuff until something sticks. And we got somewhere that stuck pretty quickly. So yeah, that style didn't take too long. Adding more people to the team was scary and I think also a necessary step. Going back to skills that we have to develop while working on this project is that's another big element of documenting everything that I have laid out and thought about. We made a style guide early on and like an art Bible, and it was pretty half-baked because I could show it to the rest of the team and put it next to the stuff that I was making and make those connections for them. Say like, I'm pulling this from this and this from this. And it was sort of clear what the style guide meant. When we brought a new artist on board, I had to pretty much completely overhaul that style guide because it actually had to include all of the different elements that I was thinking about as I was making every piece that I've made for the game. So in some respects, it was good that I was doing that at that point because I had already been working for a few months on every piece. Early on in the project, like I had a rough idea of what I was going to do style-wise and what I was... I mean, we established a style, but I hadn't done enough work to know exactly what I was thinking and keeping in mind and making sure it was consistent across all the pieces I had made. So now that I had been doing that for a few months, I could actually document what those bullet points were basically. That was really just like breaking down every element of the style, everything that I was thinking about from composition, layering of elements on our screen space, like keeping elements distinct from one another, color choices, all that kind of stuff, and then handing that over to Josh. And from that, he was really able to get a good idea of everything I had been thinking about. And from there, it's kind of just like he, from the get-go, was pretty on board with the style and got a handle of it really quick. And then for the first couple weeks, it was really just me pointing out like a few different changes he could make here and there to bring it in line with everything. And honestly, now at this point, the assets he's made, it's like perfectly on style. I think it was kind of a funny line that I took through that because I knew that I wanted to do art for a long time, and I had been playing games my whole life. And I got really into art, and I went to an art high school, and then I knew that I wanted to pursue something in art, but it was hard to know exactly what that was. Briefly, I thought I wanted to do animation. That didn't really seem like it was going to be my thing, and then I thought maybe I wanted to get into comics. And then as soon as I started looking at colleges, like I found out that game art, concept art was a thing. Like, well, damn, I've been playing games my whole life. I love games. If I can do that for that industry, that's exactly what I want to do. And from there, I just like started researching that side of every game that I played, and that was decided at that point. This is like definitely a new experience with a lot of the things I've had to be doing. Uniquely, having to draw a ton of plants is a new skill that I'm definitely having to push. But I think in the broader sense, like really art directing this project has meant a lot of different sort of thought processes for my work. Typically in any project I've worked on before, if it's just a personal project, then obviously I'm art directing myself. I know what I'm thinking at all times, so I don't really need to like lay everything out, because if I give myself enough notes, then I know what I meant by them. And also in a previous project, like I was sort of secondary leading the art team, so there was still an art director above me, and then I was a lead. And so with that, that person was still in charge of like laying out that whole vision, and I contributed to it, but it was, them laying out the pieces, documenting all that stuff, making sure that they were writing everything that everyone on the team needed. And now me having to do that, I'm sort of having to figure out how I put down my thoughts and where the sort of gaps are in naturally where I make notes for myself, and then where I need to clarify things for other people, and where I need to explain to them what I'm thinking, and all that kind of stuff. So really that like understanding and honing my ability to communicate my vision has been a big skill that I've had to develop, and that's been really helpful. I think, you know, Cave Bear's mission to make a studio for indies, for juniors in the space, really resonated with me. Obviously, the industry is sort of long standing at this point. It's sort of graduated from a very young industry. And obviously, there was a time where a lot of the big studios now that are very corporate, and the studios that contribute to the part of the industry that everyone sees as corporate and formulaic, and like, you have to get into a big job to secure your place in the industry. Like, those studios were once just people working out of a garage or out of like a small rented space. And so I think at some point you have to realize that we just got to keep doing that. We just have to keep starting at that level to make space for more people in this growing industry. And I think me as a concept artist who is wanting to work closely with like the narrative team and the creative director and really build the art side of a world from the ground up, you know, you only get that opportunity when you're coming into the beginning of a project, and that doesn't happen that much at any of these long-standing studios, you know, for them to start a new IP. So starting a new studio, starting a studio for people coming into the industry is a big opportunity to just be able to use those skills and put them into a project out into the world. The early stages were rough because we obviously are all juniors, which means that we're all sort of operating from our own experience with our own department, but that does not necessarily translate into a holistic team vision development, especially in pre-production. So things were rough. There were definitely a lot of visual things that probably needed to get established earlier. I feel like I would just tell myself like document. I think I was leaving a lot of it in my own head because I knew what was going on. But I think just really putting down everything I had would have laid the foundation for, you know, our UI person coming on and everyone else who was contributing to visuals to have all those early thoughts I had. I think one of the biggest changes and things that were hard to figure out while we were making the game is how we were going to devise the actual visuals for the hybrid plants. I ended up going through a few different versions. There was a version where every single plant had like a bottom element and a top element, and if you bred them, those two elements could switch. Obviously the parents from the other two would also switch. That made way too many combinations that I would have had to make. We could have procedurally done those more in Unity, but that would have allowed for less control over how the asset actually looked and if that plant was pleasing, which it definitely needs to be. If you're just color swapping or affecting the color in Unity, you don't have control over those values as much, if the like transitions are as nice. So eventually we swapped that system out for what it is in the game now, which is there are 4 types of plants, which means that every top half of a plant can appear on every type of plant, but they have a set bottom, which means that even if you breed them with something else, if they become that type, they're not going to actually take that plant's bottom element. They're just going to keep their own and become that type. That took a long time to establish. It sounds simple now, but that's kind of one of the funny things about game development. You don't see some of those solutions sometimes. Eventually you land on them and they feel great, but there was a long time where we just weren't quite sure how that was going to work. Another big issue early on was how we were going to display all the plants. We were obviously working with a very limited screen space compared to a lot of games, which means that just in general, I have had to sort of retool my brain for a lot of the things I've been making. because being an artist who naturally works in sort of screen-sized canvases, you think about all your compositions that way, even if you're not working in like an actual border. That's just how your brain is wired. Actually figuring out how to visualize all the stuff we wanted to put on screen at once has just been a like project long, not battle, but it's definitely like you're having to solve problems pretty much at every turn because it's not natural. One of the biggest things was figuring out how we were going to do the view of the plants in terms of, okay, if you have a bunch of plants in the room and you want a nice view of the room, which you would want because you're going to be able to decorate the room, how can we also give the player sort of total view of all the plants they have in that space? And at one point we were going to do 2 different views of the room, one that was more like sort of flat laid out from which you could access all your plants, and then you could switch back to this actual like POV shot of the room. And that sort of felt disjointed. And so it was a lot of like cheating the depth of the room, figuring out the perspectives at which we could put all those racks of plants to make them feel naturally integrated into that space, but also sort of cheating out enough to the camera that the player can still interact with them one by one, and it doesn't feel busy and it doesn't feel like they're sort of sitting on top of each other. So that was another project long problem.